The candle had burned down to a thumb's height by the time the bell above the great bed rang for the third time that night, and Esther Coyle, who had learned in her years of service to wake fully between one breath and the next, was on her feet before the sound had finished. The room smelled of camphor and old smoke, and the sweet rot of a body that had decided to be done with the world. She crossed the cold boards in her stocking feet and bent to the man who lay propped against a bank of pillows, his face the color of tallow, his eyes for once entirely awake. He had not been awake like this in a fortnight. The physician had said he would not be again. The Earl of Renfield lifted one hand from the counterpane and the hand shook, and he closed his fingers around her wrist with a grip that should not have been possible for a man so far gone. He drew her down until her ear was near his mouth. His breath was a small wind off a cold sea. "Burn the letters," he said. "The desk. The lower drawer. Burn them tonight, girl, before she finds them. Burn them. And say nothing." She had nursed him for 11 weeks. She had turned him and washed him and read to him from the only book he asked for. And not once in all that time had he spoken to her of letters, or of a drawer, or of any she who might come looking. She held very still. What she did not yet know was that she was already too late to obey him in the only way that would have kept her safe, because the letters in the lower drawer of the writing desk were letters she had read 3 nights before by the light of a single candle, when she could not sleep, and the great house had pressed on her like water. He died before the clock struck 4. He did not speak again. His hand loosened on her wrist by degrees, the way a frost lets go of a window when the sun finally reaches it, and then it was only the weight of a hand, and then it was nothing she needed to hold. Esther sat on the edge of the bed, in the gray hour, and looked at the writing desk across the room, and she thought about the lower drawer, and she did not move toward it. She was 24 years old, and she had not always been a maid. Her father had kept a small school in Dorset until a fever took him and her mother in the same hard winter, and the school had gone to a cousin who did not want the daughter that came with it, and so Esther had learned what a great many gently raised girls learn when the floor drops out from under them, which is that the world has a use for clever hands and very little use for the cleverness behind them. She could read Latin. She could cipher a column of figures faster than the steward at Brookhaven, and she had once corrected his arithmetic in her head and said nothing, because a housemaid who corrects the steward does not remain a housemaid for long. She becomes nothing at all. She had folded that part of herself away, as one folds a good gown into a trunk with paper between the layers, against a day that might never come to the house. She was the maid who read to the old Earl. To the village, she was the orphan from the school that had closed. To the housekeeper, Mrs. Maltz. Dunmore, who was not unkind but who had a great fondness for the order of things, she was a pair of steady hands and a closed mouth, which were the 2 qualities Mrs. Dunmore prized above all others in a girl. None of them knew what was in the lower drawer. Esther had assumed when she opened it that she would find nothing she could not have guessed. She had found instead a packet of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and the letters were in the Earl's own hand, drafted and never sent, and they were addressed to his son. The son was a name that was not spoken at Brookhaven. Esther had been there 19 months, and had heard it perhaps 4 times, always lowered, always abandoned mid-sentence, as if the speaker had stepped too near an edge. Henry Ashcombe. The Viscount Ashcombe, who had gone for a soldier against his father's wishes, and then done something worse than soldiering, something that had emptied his name out of every room in the house. She had pieced together only that he had been sent away, and that the dowager spoke of him as one speaks of a debt long written off, and that the Earl, in his lucid hours, sometimes turned his face to the wall and would not say why. The letters said why. The letters said a great deal. She had read them once and folded them away again, and told herself they were not hers to know. And now the man who wrote them was dead in the bed behind her, and his last waking instruction had been to put them in the fire, and the woman he feared would find them was. Esther understood with a cold certainty already in the house. The Dowager Countess of Vauncy had arrived 2 days before with 3 trunks and a lady's maid, and the particular stillness of a person who has come to take possession of something. I will tell you now, because you have stayed with me this far, that everything which followed turned on what Esther did in the next quarter of an hour. If you find yourself caring what a housemaid does with a dead man's secrets, then stay close, and let the rest unfold. She did not burn them. She told herself afterward that she had meant to, that she had risen and crossed to the desk with every intention of obedience, but the truth, which she examined later and did not like, was that she could not put fire to a father's love for his son merely because the father had grown afraid of his own sister. So she took the packet from the lower drawer and she carried it to her own narrow room under the eaves, and she slid it beneath the loose board where she kept her mother's thimble and the last letter her own father had ever written her, and she went back down to sit with the dead until the household woke. The dowager came to the death chamber at 8. She was a tall woman with a straight back and white hair dressed close to her head, and she wore gray, and she looked at her brother's body for a long moment with an expression Esther could not read and did not try to. Then she looked at the writing desk. She crossed to it directly, as a person crosses to a thing they have been thinking about, and she opened the lower drawer, and she found it empty. "The girl," she said, not turning. You sat with him through the night." "Yes, my lady." "Did he speak?" He asked for water. Esther said he was not often sensible. The dowager turned then and considered her, and Esther made of her own face the blank, steady surface she had spent 6 years perfecting, the face that says there is nothing behind this face worth your trouble. To the dowager, in that first morning, she was a servant of no consequence, a provincial nobody who had happened to be in the room. That misreading was the only thing that kept Esther safe, and she knew it, and she leaned into it the way one leans into a wind to stay upright. "She does not know what she is," the dowager said to her own maid, later on the stairs, in a voice not meant to carry, and which carried a drudge from a closed school. She read to him because he could no longer hold a book. That is the whole of her. The whole of her heard it from the landing above, and the whole of her went on polishing the banister, and said nothing. The Viscount Ashcombe came home 11 days later, on a grey afternoon with rain coming sideways off the park, and the house that had spoken his name only in whispers fell entirely silent at the sound of his horse in the courtyard. Esther was at the window of the long gallery with a cloth in her hand when he dismounted, and she saw him before he saw anyone, which is to say, she saw the truth of him before the house could arrange itself around the lie it had told about him for 3 years. He was perhaps 32. He was tall, and the rain had darkened his hair, and he stood for a moment in the courtyard looking up at the front of his father's house as a man looks at a creature that has bitten him and may bite again. There was a stillness in him that was not calm. It was the stillness of a thing held very tightly, so that it will not fly apart. He did not come to the funeral as a son. He came as a stranger, who happened to own the place now, and the difference was visible in every line of him. The dowager met him in the great hall with a coolness, so practiced it had the quality of a performance, and he answered her with a coolness of his own that was not practiced at all but quarried, hewn from something harder underneath, and Esther, carrying a tray of glasses through to the dining room, understood that whatever lay between these two had not begun with the Earl's death, and would not end with his burial. "You will want the blue rooms," the dowager said. "They were always yours." "I will take my father's rooms," the new Earl of Renfield said. His voice was low and level, and it did not rise. "The blue rooms are a child's rooms. I have not been a child in this house for some time." He looked as he said it very briefly at the doorway through which Esther was passing, and his eyes caught on her the way a coat catches on a nail. A small snag, a half-second of attention he did not intend and could not entirely retract. She felt it land between her shoulder blades after she had passed. She told herself it was nothing. A new master taking the measure of the staff. She was wrong about what it was, and her body knew she was wrong before her mind would permit the knowledge, for her pulse had quickened at a glance from a man she had seen for the length of a single breath, and she set the tray down in the dining room with great care because her hands had decided on their own to be unsteady. She learned his griefs the way a servant learns everything, which is to say, obliquely from the edges. She learned that he did not sleep, because the candle in the master rooms burned all night, and the wax was gone each morning. She learned that he would not enter the library, which had been his father's favorite room, and that when business forced him to its threshold, he stopped at the door as if a cord were tied across it at the height of his chest. She learned that he flinched once very slightly when a footman addressed him as "my lord," and that he covered the flinch at once, but that she had seen it, and that the seeing of it lodged in her like a splinter she could not reach. What she did not yet understand was the cause, and the cause was in the packet beneath her floorboard, and every day that she did not give it to him, she carried the weight of a thing he needed and did not know existed. The letters told it plainly, in the Earl's own crabbed hand. 3 years before, the Viscount Ashcombe had been accused of a debt of honor he had not incurred, a matter of a forged note and a friend's ruin, and the friend, a young man named Pell, had taken his own life, and the world had decided that Ashcombe had driven him to it through a loan called in cruelly, at the worst possible hour. The Earl had believed it. The Earl had believed it because the Dowager had laid the evidence before him with her own hands, the note in what appeared to be his son's writing, the dates, the testimony of a clerk, and the Earl in his grief and his pride had cast his son out and forbidden his name in the house. And then the letters said, the Earl had learned the truth 2 years too late, when the clerk confessed on his deathbed that the note had been forged, and the forger paid, and the Earl had sat down at his writing desk and begun to draft the letters that would call his son home and beg his pardon. And he had drafted them and torn them up and drafted them again. 11 of them, and sent not one, because a proud man who has wronged his only son does not know how to say so. And so he had carried it down into the dark with him, and he had died trying to burn the evidence that he had loved the boy after all. Esther knew, holding those pages, exactly what the Dowager had done. She knew that the woman downstairs had ruined a man to protect the order of a house, and that she had let her brother die, believing his son a villain because the alternative was to confess her own hand in it. And she knew that she, a housemaid, was the only living person who held the proof. She might have gone to him at once. She has been asked in the years since why she did not, and her answer has always been the same, that a servant who walks into the master's study with a packet of letters that prove his banishment was a lie does not get a hearing. She gets dismissed without a character and put on the road in the rain, and the letters go into the fire after all. And nothing is mended, and a great deal is lost. She needed him to know her first, as something other than a drudge. She needed, though she would not have used the word, to be seen. The chance came in the schoolroom of all places. On a wet morning, in the 2nd week, there was a child in the house, the late Earl's ward, a small grave boy of 7 named Tom, the son of a cousin dead in the same war that had taken so much, and the boy had been kept in the nursery wing like a piece of furniture nobody had decided what to do with, and his governess had given notice the week the old Earl died and not been replaced. Esther had taken to reading with him in stolen quarter hours, because the boy was starved for it, and because she could not help herself. And on this morning, she was in the schoolroom with Tom and a book of fables when the new Earl of Renfield came down the corridor on some errand of his own, and stopped outside the door, which stood ajar. She did not see him. She was reading the fable of the lion and the mouse, and then she had stopped reading it, and was explaining to Tom in a low, clear voice why the mouse was the more admirable creature, because courage in a small thing that has everything to lose is worth more than courage in a great thing that risks little, and the boy was arguing with her. And she was letting him argue, drawing the argument out of him the way her father had once drawn arguments out of his pupils, and the Latin tag she used to settle it came out of her without thought, and she translated it for the boy at once, and without condescension. The Earl stood in the corridor and listened to a housemaid teach his ward in the manner of a person who had been finely educated and had buried the fact, and he did not come in, and he did not speak, and when Esther finally looked up, the doorway was empty. She did not know how long he had stood there. She knew only that the next morning, a parcel of books appeared in the schoolroom that had not been there before, good books, a Latin grammar and a child's history, and a volume of verse, and that no one said who had sent them. That was the first deposit. There would be many. He began to find reasons to be where she was. A great house gives a man 1,000 pretexts, and he used them all with a face that admitted to none. He wanted a book found in the library. And would she find it, since she seemed to know the shelves? He wished the schoolroom fire kept up since the boy was there of a morning. He required, he said, someone sensible to go through his father's papers in the study, and Mrs. Dunmore had named her as the most sensible of the maids, and so for 3 hours of an afternoon, Esther sat at a small table in the Earl's study, sorting a dead man's correspondence, while the Earl sat at the great desk, pretending to attend to his own. The study had 2 chairs and a great deal of silence, and the silence was not empty. She was aware of him as she had never been aware of any person in a room, aware of the exact angle of his shoulders, of the moment he stopped writing and did not start again, of the weight of a regard she could feel and would not turn to meet. When she reached across the table for a fresh stack of papers, her sleeve brushed the edge of his hand where it rested, the barest contact, gone before either of them could name it, and she heard him go entirely still, and she kept her eyes on the page and felt her own heartbeat in her throat like a second clock. "Miss Coyle," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She had not known. He knew it. "You were not raised to this," he said. It was not a question, and it was not unkind. It was a man stating a thing he had worked out and found he could not leave unstated. "My father kept a school," she said. "He is dead. The school is closed. This is the work there is." He was quiet for a moment. The rain had stopped, and the light through the tall window had the thin gold quality of a wet afternoon clearing, and it lay across the papers between them. "You read to my father," he said, "every day at the end. He liked the Psalms, and he liked Mr. Cowper, and he did not like to be read to slowly, as though he were a child or a fool." Something moved in the Earl's face, some pressure briefly relieved, and Esther understood that he was hungry for any account of the father he had not been permitted to bury as a son, that he had come home too late for everything, and would now spend his life collecting the small change of other people's memories because the gold had been denied him. She could have ended it. Then the letters were 40 feet above her head, under a board. She had only to say, "There is something you must see." She did not say it. The moment was too thin, too new, and she was too much afraid of breaking the only thread of regard she had ever been given, by a man who could not gain a thing by giving it. She said instead, "He spoke of you at the end. He did not know me well enough to confide, but he spoke your name once, when he thought no one heard. It was the truth, and it was a kindness, and it was also a door left open a crack. And she saw him feel the draught of it." He set down his pen. What did he say? "He said it as one says the name of a person one is trying to call back," Esther said. "That is all I can tell you, my lord. I am sorry it is not more." The Earl looked at her for a long moment, and there was in his look the beginning of a question that had nothing to do with his father, and then he mastered it, the way he mastered everything, and he told her she might go. She gathered the papers and rose, and at the door he said her name again, "Miss Coyle," and when she turned, he seemed to have forgotten what he meant to say, and what he said at last was only, "The fire in the schoolroom. See that it is kept up. The boy feels the cold." It was a command. It was about the boy. It was, she understood, as she climbed the stairs with her heart going hard, about her and about the schoolroom where he had first heard her teach, and about a man who did not know how to say "stay" near, and so said "tend the fire" instead. The body knows these things before the mind consents to them. Her body had known since the courtyard. Her mind caught up to it on the back stairs between the 2nd floor and the 3rd, and she had to stop with her hand on the cold wall and breathe. The Dowager Countess of Vancy watched all of this with the patience of a woman who has spent a lifetime watching the small motions by which households arrange themselves, and she did not like what she saw. She had come to Brookhaven to secure 2 things. The first was the marriage of her great niece. a polished and pretty young woman named Lady Cassandra Fenn, to the new Earl, a match arranged in principle years before the unpleasantness, and which the dowager regarded as the natural repair of a damaged line. The second was the perpetual silence of the matter of young Pell, which had been her own work, and which she believed safely buried with her brother. She did not yet know that the second was in danger. She knew only that the new Earl looked at a housemaid in a way that no arrangement of hers had accounted for, and she set herself to correct it. Lady Cassandra was installed in the best of the guest rooms and brought down to dinner in silk the color of a dove's breast, and she was charming, and she was not stupid, and she had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice for exactly this kind of man, and she behaved accordingly. At dinner, she spoke of mutual acquaintance, and of the season and of the improvements the house wanted, and the Earl answered her with a courtesy that was perfectly correct and perfectly without warmth, and the dowager watched him not warm to her great niece, and understood that she would have to do more than arrange a dinner. The dismissive label found its second voicing at that table, though Esther was not in the room to hear it. She heard it afterward from the footman who served, a kind, slow man named Harris, who had no love for the dowager. The Earl had asked idly who was seeing to the boy's lessons, and the dowager had said with a small laugh, meant to close the subject, "Oh, one of the maids amuses him, the orphan, a drudge from a closed school down in Dorset. Harmless enough. We shall find a proper governess once the house is settled." A drudge from a closed school. The same words, in a grander room before the man whose regard Esther had begun to depend on without admitting it. Harris said the Earl had not smiled, and had changed the subject, and that the temperature at the table had dropped several degrees, in a manner the dowager affected not to notice. Esther, hearing it, went up to her room and took the packet of letters from under the board and held it in her lap for a long time. She knew now that she could not wait much longer. The dowager was a builder of walls, and every day she built the marriage higher, and the silence deeper, and once the Earl was married to Lady Cassandra, the truth would have nowhere to land. She also knew, with the part of her that had survived 6 years of service, that the moment she produced these letters she ceased to be a person and became an instrument, a thing the Earl would use, and then, in gratitude or in discomfort, send away with a sum of money and a good character. She would have given him back his father and lost him in the same hour. She put the letters away again. She was not proud of it. She has never pretended otherwise. What forced her hand was the boy. It happened on a cold, bright morning near the end of the month. The dowager had decided that the nursery wing was to be reordered, that the late Earl's ward was to be sent to a school in the north that took the unwanted sons of dead cousins and turned them out fit for a regiment or a counting house, and that this was to be arranged at once, before the new Earl could form an attachment to the child that might complicate the settlement of the estate. She informed Mrs. Dunmore of the plan as a thing decided. She did not inform the Earl on the grounds that gentlemen did not concern themselves with nursery matters and would only be relieved to have it managed for them. Esther was sent to pack the boy's things. She found him sitting very straight on the edge of his bed, with his hands folded, the way a child sits when he has been told he is going somewhere and is determined not to cry about it, and he asked her in a voice scoured clean of hope whether the school in the north was very far, and whether anyone there would let him keep his books. And Esther, who had been a child set on a road by people who found her inconvenient, who knew exactly the shape of the floor dropping out, looked at the small grave boy and felt the last of her caution burn off her like mist. She did not pack the trunk. She set it down and she took Tom by the hand and she walked him down through the house to the door of the library, where the Earl stood that morning at the very threshold he could not cross, looking into the room where his father had wronged him, and she stopped before him with the child's hand in hers, and she did the most dangerous thing a servant can do, which is to speak first. "My lord," she said, "they mean to send your ward away to the north tomorrow. He is 7 years old, and he has lost everyone, and no one has asked you, because they did not think you would care. I think you would care. I think you should be asked." The corridor was very quiet. The boy looked up at the tall stranger who owned his fate. The Earl looked at Esther, and then at the boy, and then at Esther again, and something happened in his face that she had not seen there before, a kind of breaking that was also a kind of mending, and he went down on one knee on the cold stone, which an earl does not do. And the boy said, "Yes, please," in a whisper, and the earl said, "Then you will stay," and rose, and his hand, when it came to rest for a moment on Esther's shoulder, was not steady. "You should not have had to ask me," he said very low, meaning the boy he was looking at her. When he said it, however, and they both knew the sentence had two faces, the dowager learned of it within the hour, and understood that she had lost the boy, and was in danger of losing a great deal more, and she did what such people do when the ground shifts, which is to strike at the visible cause. She could not strike at the earl, so she struck at the maid. She came to the still room where Esther was working alone, and she shut the door behind her. And she did not raise her voice, because women of her kind never raise their voices. They lower them, until a person has to lean in to be wounded. "You have ideas above your station," she said. "You have inserted yourself into the affairs of this family. You have set the boy against my arrangements. You have made yourself conspicuous to my nephew, in a manner that a girl of your sort can only intend. One way, I know what you are. I have known women like you in every house I have ever entered. You see a man in grief and a fortune unattached, and you imagine the world has changed its rules. For you, it has not. You will be gone from this house by the end of the week, without a character. You will find that the world remembers what you are, even when it has forgotten your name." "A drudge!" she said, leaning very close. From a closed school. That was the third voicing, and it was the cruelest, because it was meant not to describe, but to destroy. And it landed in the small, cold room with no one to witness it, but the woman it was meant to break. Esther stood with her hands quiet at her sides and took it. She had taken worse. That night, though she did not put the letters back under the board, she sat on her narrow bed with the packet in her hands, and she understood that she had run out of time, that the choice was no longer between speaking and keeping the earl's regard, but between speaking and watching the dowager wall the truth up forever with herself dismissed, and the boy saved only by an accident that would not come twice. She had been protecting a private hope. The hope was a luxury. The truth was not. She went down very early the next morning, before the house woke, and she found the earl already in the study, having not slept, the candle a ruin of wax beside him. He looked up when she came in, surprised, and she did not give herself time to lose her nerve. She crossed the room and set the packet of letters on the desk before him, on the blue ribbon faded almost to gray. These were in the lower drawer of his desk. She said he asked me, the night he died, to burn them. I did not. I think you must read them, and then I think you will understand why I could not, and why I should have brought them to you the first day, and was too much a coward to do it. They are his letters to you. He wrote them after he learned the truth. He never sent one. The earl looked at the packet, as a man looks at a snake that may be dead, or may be sleeping. Then he untied the ribbon, and he read. And Esther stood by the cold window and watched a man learn, in the space of a quarter of an hour, that the central fact of his ruined life was a lie, that his father had not believed him guilty at the end, but had died trying to reach him, that the friend whose death he had carried like a stone in his chest had been destroyed by the same forgery that destroyed him, and that the hand behind it all was the hand of the woman who had arranged a marriage for him, and meant to send a child to the north, and had called the only person who would tell him the truth a drudge. He did not weep. She had thought he might, and he did not, and what he did instead was worse, to watch, which was nothing at all. A stillness that went on, while the gray light strengthened, until at last he set the last letter down, and laid his hand flat upon the packet as though to keep it from rising, and said, in a voice she had to strain to hear, 3 years. And then after a while you read these. You knew what was in them. I read them, she said. I am sorry. They were not mine to read. I am not sorry. I did not burn them, however, because if I had, you would never have known he loved you. And that, my lord, you should not have been made to do without." He looked at her then, fully, with everything stripped away, the rank and the coldness and the 3 years of carrying a stranger's crime, and what was left was only a man looking at the one person who had refused to let him be unseen. He stood. He crossed to her. He stopped close enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, and the salt track that had, after all, escaped him at the corner of one eye, and he lifted his hand and did not quite touch her face, his fingers hovering at the line of her jaw, near enough that she felt the warmth of them, and he held there, neither advancing nor retreating, while the whole unspoken weight of the month pressed into the inch of air between his hand and her skin. "I have wanted," he said, and stopped, and began again. "I have wanted, since the schoolroom, to ask you to stay, not as a servant. I did not know how. I do not know how now. I know, though, that I have been seen by no one in 3 years, and that you saw me before I gave you any reason to look, and I find I cannot do without it." Her mouth wanted to deflect, to retreat into the safety of station, to say, "My lord, you are overwrought," and her body would not let her. Her hand had come up of its own accord, and rested now against his chest, over the hard knock of his heart, not pushing him away, only there, and her breath had gone shallow, and when she finally spoke the truth came out of her plainly, because there was no longer anywhere to fold it away. "I have wanted the same thing," she said. "I have had no business wanting it. I have wanted it all the same." He bent his head. He did not kiss her. He rested his brow against hers, and they stood like that in the gray light over the unburned letters. Two people who had each been told by the world that they were a thing to be discarded, holding still at the edge of a thing that could not be unmade, and neither of them crossed the last inch, because once it was crossed there was no pretending the world had not changed, and they were not quite ready, in that cold dawn, to ask the world to change. The hesitation was its own confession. They stepped back from it together. By agreement, neither had spoken, and the stepping back was the most intimate thing that had passed between them yet. There remained the matter of the house, and the woman who ran it, and the order she had built on a lie. The Earl did not strike in private. He had learned, perhaps from the letters, what private striking cost. He waited 3 days, until the dining room was full, until Lady Cassandra was arranged at the dowager's right hand in dove-gray silk, and the neighboring families were assembled, and the long table seated its full number under the blaze of the candles, the same room in which his courtesy to Cassandra had been read by every one as the prelude to a settlement. The dowager was in high color that night. She believed Esther dismissed. The boy's fate merely delayed the marriage advancing. She did not know that the Earl had spent 3 days with a solicitor and a magistrate and the deathbed deposition of a clerk, all of it set in order, all of it sealed. He rose to speak before the second course, and the table quieted, expecting an announcement, and they were not wrong that there was one to make. He spoke first of his father plainly, and then he spoke of young Pell, and a stillness came over the table that was not the stillness of polite attention. He said that a forgery had ruined 2 men and killed 1, and that the truth of it had been established beyond any doubt. The clerk's confession witnessed, the forger named, the payment traced. He did not look at the dowager as he said it. He did not need to. The looking was done by everyone else, the slow turning of 30 faces toward the head of the table where the Dowager Countess of Vansy sat with her fan halfway to her face and stopping there halfway, neither raised nor lowered, while the color went out of her in patches. Then he did the thing that the room could not undo. He set down a name. He did not make a speech. He said one sentence, level and clear, into the silence the description had built. "The person who restored my father to me will be the next Countess of Renfield." He did not say, "the maid." He did not say Esther Coyle, who stood frozen against the wall, with a wine jug in her hands, the servant whom the room had not until that instant considered a person. He said the next Countess, and then he crossed the room, in front of the assembled families and the displaced rival and the woman who had called her a drudge 3 times in 3 settings. And he took the jug from Esther's hands and set it on the sideboard and offered her his arm. And the room understood, all at once and entirely, what it was being shown. The dowager's fan came down at last. She fragmented, as such people do, into the small repeated motions of a structure failing. She said, "You cannot," twice, and then she said the girl is nothing, she is, and could not finish it because the word she reached for was the word she had used 3 times, and it would not come a fourth. It had been spent, it had become a confession rather than a weapon, and she heard it become one, and she stopped. Lady Cassandra, to her lasting credit, was the first at the table to recover, and what she did was rise and incline her head to Esther with a small, precise correctness, and say, "I wish you joy," in a voice that was steady, because she had been told her whole life she was the correct choice and was clever enough to understand, in that moment, that she had merely been a choice, and that this was a different thing, and that the difference was the whole of it. The magistrate, who had been seated quietly near the foot of the table and whom no one had thought to wonder about, rose then as well, and confirmed in a few dry words that the matter of Pell had been reopened and resolved, that the late Earl's son stood entirely cleared, and that depositions were filed and sealed and not subject to any private rearrangement. He sat down again. The thing was law. The dowager could not unmake it with a fan, or a laugh, or a lowered voice, and she knew it, and Esther, watching her, felt no triumph, only the strange, flat quiet that comes when a long-feared thing turns out to be in the end merely a person, and a defeated one. The dowager left Brookhaven within the week. She was not destroyed. She was corrected, displaced, made small, in the one place where her smallness had always shone and been ignored, and she went to a sister in Bath with her 3 trunks and her lady's maid, and the house exhaled when her carriage cleared the gate. Lady Cassandra went too, with no hard feeling that anyone could detect, and married a baronet within the year, and was by all accounts content, having been released from a correctness that had never had warmth in it. It was winter before the house was wholly Esther's, and the snow came early that year. She married him in the small church on the estate, not in a grand wedding before the season, but in a plain ceremony, with the boy Tom standing up very straight in a new coat, and Mrs. Dunmore weeping into a handkerchief she pretended was for the cold, and Harris, the footman, beaming from the back pew. And afterward there was no ball and no crowd, only the family party returning to the house through falling snow to a fire built high in the room that had once been forbidden. The library. The Earl could enter it now. He had gone in alone the day after the dinner, and come out an hour later, and never spoken of what he did there. But the cord across the threshold was gone, and the room was warm now of an evening, and the boy did his lessons at the long table, while the snow fell past the tall windows. On the night of her wedding, Esther sat by that fire with the packet of letters in her lap, the blue ribbon retied, and she untied it once more, and read the last of them aloud to her husband, the one the old Earl had drafted last and torn least, the one that came nearest to being sent. It asked the son to come home. It said the father had been wrong and proud and a fool, and that he had loved the boy from his first hour, and had let a lie persuade him otherwise, and that he did not expect forgiveness, but asked, all the same, that Henry come home before it was too late, and it was dated a month before the Earl took to his bed, and it had not been too late, only just. Only barely, because a housemaid had refused to put it in the fire. The Earl took the letter from her when she had finished, and he folded it along its old creases, and he set it not into the fire but into the drawer of the desk in the library, the drawer that locked, and he kept the key, and Esther understood that the letters had found at last the only safe place a thing like that can find, which is the keeping of the person it was meant to reach, outside. The snow went on falling, soft and steady, over the park and the church and the long avenue down which a son had ridden home too late, and not, in the end, too late at all. Inside the fire settled, and the boy yawned over his Latin, and the new Countess of Renfield sat with her husband's hand in hers, in a house that had spent 3 years telling a lie about love, and would now spend the rest of its years simply having some. The key to the drawer hung on a ribbon at her wrist. She had been a drudge from a closed school. She was, it turned out, the keeper of the letters and the keeper of the man. And there is no smaller word for what she had become that would not also be a lie, and the house had had enough of those. If this story stayed with you, perhaps you will carry one small part of it away, the part where a person refuses to burn a thing that ought to be read. Thank you for staying until the end.